Well, it's now being called a virtual work stoppage. NYPD officers dramatically slowing down their policing activities in the wake of the execution of two city officers. According to the New York Post, overall arrests in the city last week were down by 66% when compared with the same period last year. Also, traffic tickets and summonses for minor offenses have dropped by a staggering 94%, and even parking violations are down, dropping 92%. Police told the Post that safety concerns were the main reason for the decrease in police activity. However, they added that a lot of cops are issuing this slowdown in protest of the mayor's response to the events surrounding the police chokehold death of Eric Garner. The impetus of that tension came after Mayor Bill de Blasio empathized with the protesters in the aftermath of the news that the police officer responsible for killing Eric Garner would not be indicted and would walk free. And that tension heightened just this past weekend as hundreds of officers from across the country turned their backs on the mayor in a sign of protest during the funeral of Officer Rafael Ramos. To discuss the latest, earlier I was joined by Robert Gangi, director of the Police Reform Organizing Project. And I first asked for his reaction to Bill de Blasio's initial response to all of this.
No, first of all, I want to say I'm pleased to be here. And in response to that question, no. I mean, de Blasio, well, I mean, the death of Eric Garner at the hands of police officers, as recorded by the video that has been seen by millions and millions of people, was shocking. And the video shows real excessive use of force, reckless and brutal behavior by not just Pantaleo, who was the officer who applied the chokehold, but by 4 or 5 other officers who jumped Garner, smothered him, and then even after he said 11 times, "I can't breathe," as the video records, you see them in the video just standing around chatting like maybe about the Yankee game that day while he's lying lifeless on the ground. So the acts of the police officers in that situation were irresponsible, were reckless. That there's no indictment of Pantaleo or of any other officers was shocking. So I think it was appropriate that de Blasio expressed sympathy with the protesters. The vast majority of New Yorkers at that time were sympathetic with the protesters because of the video and what people saw in the video.
The video indeed was very shocking and moving. Now, of course, after all of that, we had this unfortunate incident happen. 2 police officers killed in their patrol cars for no reason whatsoever. And we heard a very strong reaction from the head of the police union in the aftermath of that. I'm sure you've heard it, but let's take a listen to it.
Sure.
There's blood on many hands tonight. Those that incited violence on the street under the guise of protest that tried to tear down what New York City police officers did every day. We tried to warn, it must not go on, it cannot be tolerated. That blood on the hands starts on the steps of City Hall in the office of the mayor.
So he says there's blood on the mayor's hands. Very harsh words there. And the New York Times editorial board recently said his statements amounted to a public act of extortion by the police. What do you think about those statements? I mean, do you think that they're representative of just the police? Are they representative of a portion of the public? What do you think?
Well, it's hard to assess without polling, but my reaction, and I know the reaction of the New York Times editorial board, obviously, and other people across the city, was that if anybody should be apologizing at the moment, it should be Pat Lynch. His statements were demagogic. His statements were irresponsible. His statements were a kind of verbal violence. And it cannot be in any way laid at the doorstep of the mayor that he is somehow responsible for the death, the really tragic and unfortunate death of those 2 police officers. I'm surprised the mayor is willing to sit down in the same room with Lynch. He should be called out by the mayor, and not only by editorial boards, but by other political figures in the city. He's the one who's being primarily responsible, contributing much more in a much more real way than the mayor to the breach between police officers and the mayor at this time. the mayor has gone out of his way to express sympathy with police officers and support for the police department. In fact, his support for the police department runs up against criticism from my organization, the Police Reform Organizing Project. De Blasio has embraced broken windows policing, which is the kind of policing that, in fact, the cops now that are engaged in this work stoppage, they're in effect scaling back and pulling back from broken windows policing. We, ironically, have welcomed this so-called work stoppage on the part of police officers. They're only reducing arrest practices and summonses practices for petty infractions. And one of the problems with broken windows policing is that it focuses on petty infractions. It focuses on innocuous activities like the Eric Garner situation where he was selling loose cigarettes. They also, through broken windows policing, police officers also target low-income communities of color. So the kind of infractions that people of color get arrested for and ticketed for in New York City have been effectively criminalized decriminalized, in well-to-do white communities. So there's a stark racial bias that characterizes policing practices in New York City. The mayor was attempting in a fairly careful way to express some sympathy, particularly for people of color, because he's aware of the bias. And at that point, Lynch started to turn on him, and it's hard to know how popular Lynch's attacks on the mayor are within the police force, because there's probably no police officer, even if they disagree with Lynch, that will publicly criticize Lynch.
Sure. And, you know, what's interesting is that when this whole movement began, this sort of anti-police tactic movement, where it was about police militarization, police excessive force, lack of police accountability, has really sort of shifted. Now it seems that the conversation is really about the tension between the officers and the city and not being on their side and all of this. What do you think the implications of that are? I mean, we need to acknowledge that there are very important police reforms that the public has been calling for. What do you think about that?
Well, one point, and I like the way you put it when you said anti-police tactics. We in the reform movement are not anti-cop, even though people like Pat Lynch and others try to characterize us that way. We are anti what we consider to be unjust and biased police policies that come from the central office of the NYPD. So that's a critical point. And I think now the challenge for us, the people in the reform movement, is to, after the New Year's, after the funeral for the second officer who was shot down, is to return to the most important parts of our agenda and to do it in a way that makes it clear that we respect the lives of police officers as we respect the lives of all the people in New York City. And we are still very concerned about what we consider to be the bad practices under the umbrella of broken windows policing, racially biased practices. And we will then basically go back to putting pressure on Mayor de Blasio to abandon broken windows policing and to abolish the quota system in New York City that puts pressure on police officers to hand out summonses and to make arrests for petty infractions. In fact, in a way, this so-called work stoppage is one way to view it, is police not only engaging in anti-de Blasio protests, they're in some very real ways engaging in a protest against broken windows policing and against quota-driven policing. And we support their gestures in that regard.
All right, Robert Gangi, director of the Police Reform Organizing Project, thanks so much for your time.
Well, thank you again for having me.